Thank you very much, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today as we explore protecting privacy rights in the digital age. I'm pleased to be joined by my teammates Imani, Harshini, and Caroline, and we're very thankful to have our sponsor here today as well. And we are also very excited to share our Policy Lab challenge with you. As mentioned, it is sponsored by Interac, and we're specifically looking at what regulatory and legislative changes are needed to recognize digital privacy as a basic human right for all. And we'll also be exploring this tension between digital privacy protections, trust, and economic growth. And our sponsor, Interac, is very well versed with the need for privacy protections and has been very innovative in its regulatory practices and public education. And although they have the challenge of not being able to directly develop and implement legislation on this issue, there is a changing privacy regime in Canada currently with Bill C-27 being proposed in the House right now. And they have a special opportunity to inspire national conversations around digital privacy and what Canadians across the country would like to see in terms of trust, privacy protections, and economic growth. So we'll start off with our context and what we've been working with, and then we'll take you through the policy landscape we have currently and why and how we are recommending moving towards a human rights-based approach to digital privacy. And then we'll introduce our recommendations. Firstly, raising the level of responsibility. Secondly, engineering an environment of trust. And we'll end off with our implementation plan. Now I'll hand it over to Harshini to talk about the context.
So I just want to do a quick show of hands here. Who here has a smartphone, has ever used Google in their life? Yeah, that's pretty much everyone in the room. The reason we're here to talk to you about this issue today is because we live in a digital age where every single one of your online interactions is a data point and becomes a digital footprint. This is leading to a scale of data collection and use that is colossal. Currently, the digital economy is more than 15% of global GDP, and it's growing twice as fast as physical GDP. There is a universal rush for data because there's an ability to derive value from it. Everyone from businesses to nonprofit organizations to political parties are using your personal information and converting it into insights in terms of your preferences, your opinions, your likes, and using that to inform their business practices, how they fundraise, or how they campaign. You yourselves are deriving value from data, specifically from data-driven innovations. Personalization is massive today. So the ability to take your behavioral cues, who you connect with, what you say, can be put into ChatGPT to create the text that you need or the Instagram reels that you want to see. All of this is being propelled and has been propelled since the pandemic occurred in Canada. This massive digital transformation globally was noted when customer interactions online jumped from 36% in December 2019 to 58% in July of 2020. Quite the jump. And at the heart of all of this change is your personal information. Clearly, there's a great deal of economic value for personal information, but it's also inherent to your privacy. So you might be wondering, with data growing and growing and growing, where exactly is your personal information going and what is being done to it? Honestly speaking, we don't have an answer to that question. We don't know where it's going. We don't know what's being done to it. But what we do know is what is being done to your data is not always what you've consented to. And the best example of this is the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook event. In 2018, Facebook came under investigation because Cambridge Analytica, a UK-based analytics company, obtained millions of Americans' information. They took that information, used it to create profiles on what their voting intentions would be in the 2016 elections. Those profiles were then used to create targeted political ads and campaigns. This is a very stark reality of what it means to exist in the digital economy today. Not only is there threats to privacy, there is also threat to society and democracy as a whole. So ever since Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, we have been seeing a decline in trust in general in businesses and organizations where it concerns the protection of privacy. The 2023 survey from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada reveals that 39% of respondents believed that businesses could protect privacy rights. That's a decline from 45% in 2020. Imagine that, 6% in just 3 years. People, when they share their information, expect that business are doing exactly what it is that they've consented to. That's not always the case. Earlier this year, Home Depot was caught sharing their personal information of clients to Meta, formerly Facebook. All people had consented to was receiving e-receipts. The lack of trust is not the only issue that occurs with privacy infringements. There is a disproportionate impact that is seen for traditionally marginalized communities, whether it's over-surveillance from the over-collection of data, discrimination from data processing, or civil and political rights put at risk. This is an entire group of people. Every single one of us in this room are completely impacted by that. And so while data is ubiquitous, trust is not, which begs the question of, as more technologies are being developed, whether it's generative AI or others, where exactly should the world be going in an environment like this?
Now, there are no global laws that govern data protection, so it's really up to national, subnational, and sometimes supranational governments to come up with rules to deal with these associated harms that Harshini's just laid out for us. Jurisdictions similar to Canada, and even within Canada, started updating their privacy laws 10 years ago in recognition of this. Let's start with the European Union. In 2016, the European Union introduced the General Data Protection Regulation, which repealed an old law from 1995. The GDPR is largely touted as the gold standard, and it takes a human rights-based approach to privacy. It applies to all entities in the EU. It introduces stringent fines for those who violate the law, and it also introduces new privacy rights to Europeans, such as the right to be forgotten. Moving on, there have been various states in the US that have also started to respond to these challenges in the digital space. One of the most prominent laws comes from California. In 2018, California passed the California Consumer Privacy Act. This takes a consumer rights-based approach to privacy, so it only applies to businesses. However, they do also give consumers certain rights, such as the right to opt out from the sale of their personal information. Something to note about the California model is that it is only limited to 1, businesses, 2, businesses that reach a certain revenue threshold and have a certain number of users whose data they collect. And then we come to Quebec. Quebec passed Law 25 in 2021, and it very much is inspired by the GDPR. It introduces more stringent privacy rules for Quebec organizations, and it also introduces more powers for the Privacy Supervisory Authority in Quebec. Now, as these rules start to change, businesses are looking for a more globally interoperable privacy regime so that they can more easily transfer their data between different jurisdictions. Which begs the question, what will Canada do? Let's start with where we already are. Here we have the current policy and legislation landscape for Canadian privacy laws as they concern non-governmental actors. We'll start with the first one on the left, which is PIPEDA, or the Personal Information and Protection of Electronic Documents Act. This was passed in 2001, and it was developed to build trust in the e-commerce sector. Next, we have the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. This is the enforcement body, I use quotation marks, we'll talk about it later, of PIPEDA. And then finally, we have privacy law outside of commercial use, and this is really about the use of data that comes from the voter registration list. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that we've listed 6 different areas that make up a strong privacy regimes. We came up with these 6 different areas based on our interviews with stakeholders where they identified certain gaps in Canada's regime, along with some of the strengths from other regimes. By looking at other regimes and looking at the gaps, we've given a sort of robustness rating to Canada's current privacy policy regime. Let's start with consent. Canada's current privacy regime is based on consent. A business needs your consent to obtain your information. Something that's very good about the regime is that it notes that consent can only be valid if a person can be reasonably expected to understand what it is that they're consenting to. However, the problem with this regime is that it allows for both explicit and implicit consent, which has led to certain misinterpretations and convolutions in the law. And it's led to certain instances such as the Home Depot case that Harshini had laid out for us before. Now, we've listed the other regimes here because many stakeholders have told us that consent cannot serve as a primary basis of a solid privacy regime. So let's go down the list, starting with data processing governance. One of the challenges with our current law is that it doesn't actually provide standards for certain privacy-enhancing technologies, which means it can lull people into a false sense of security about what's being done with their data. Next, we have enforcement. Coming back to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, I put enforcer in quotation marks because they actually operate under an ombuds model. It means they can't actually order anyone to do anything. They can't find them if they're doing anything wrong. All of that makes its way through the courts, and that can be a years-long process. When the OPC files an application to the federal court, the court treats the case as new. It offers no deference to the decision of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and it takes years to move through the courts. This is very different compared to jurisdictions abroad in Europe and even jurisdictions within Canada, such as Quebec, such as Alberta, such as British Columbia. Moving on, we have protection of sensitive information. The law does recognize that sensitive information or any information can be considered sensitive depending on the context, but it provides no principles as to the safeguard of that information. On activities governed, we really only govern commercial activities and use of personal information from the Voters Registration Act. But what about all of the information that's used by political parties for other purposes? Not covered under the federal law at all. And finally, we have support for organizations. The OPC does have a directorate that's dedicated to support businesses. However, the amount of work that they do pales in comparison to the amount of work that their government advisory services do. Just for numbers, last year, they initiated 14 advisory activities with businesses, whereas they had 105 consultations with government. And I'm going to leave things there, but I'm going to pass things off to Caroline, who's going to walk us through what the proposed legislation that the government has put forward looks like.
So the federal government is in the midst of changing the privacy regime through Bill C-27, which is otherwise known as the Digital Implementation Charter Act. It comprises of two parts. One is the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, and the other is the Data Protection Tribunal Act. The aim of this bill is to equip Canadian organizations to handle the dynamic privacy protection landscape by creating a modern and rigorous framework which is based in line with international developments. So we can see that on the left-hand side, we have some of the strengths that the bill has, but there are also certain limitations which we have placed on the right. To begin with, consent, very much to its counterpart that Imani mentioned in terms of PIPEDA, it is really strong on the consent-based model. In terms of data processing, for the first time, a Canadian legislation talks about data-enhancing technologies, namely de-identification and anonymization of data, which we will be talking about in detail. The third is in terms of enforcement. So the current bill proposes the establishment of a new administrative tribunal for the OPC. So that's a step towards privacy enhancement and also better than the current ombudsman model that we have. On the right-hand side, we have tried to place some of the limitations of the bill. To begin with, the first one is protection of sensitive information. So the bill does not define what sensitive information constitutes of. So it's open for interpretation. So anything from your biometrics to your date of birth can be interpreted as a sensitive information. So there is ambiguity within the bill about that. Second, activities governed. Just like PIPEDA, this bill only is applicable to organizations that collect and process large amount of information within commercial interests. But we know that there are other organizations that collect large amount of information that is outside commercial activities. The third one is support for organization. The bill fails to recognize that the OPC still need resources and especially support for small and medium enterprises, and that is something that we will be focusing on as we go along.
So one thing to note in terms of the proposed legislation as well as current legislation is that it honors a tradition of viewing privacy through a commercial lens. What I mean by that is, let's take PIPEDA, for example. PIPEDA focuses on promoting and supporting e-commerce, and data protections or privacy protections are a means of doing that. However, privacy is not just a means by which we can facilitate a commercial transaction between two parties. Privacy is a fundamental human right. It means that it is inalienable from you. It means that when you infringe upon privacy, you have identity-based implications, which I have outlined earlier before. And so when you start to think about privacy in this way, when you sign a set of terms and agreement, you can't just sign away your human rights. In 2019, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution of protecting the right to privacy in a digital age and the need to make sure that governments are following through with that. So when you put that into perspective, let's consider what it means to understand privacy from a commercial lens. It basically means you would be asking questions such as, how do I secure data during a transaction? or what needs to be in the set of terms and conditions that people can consent to. But when you view privacy from the lens of human rights, the questions you start asking are, who gets hurt when data is misused? Or what kind of an environment am I asking people to consent within? This is something that we've learned from our stakeholders as well as the research, that Canada actually needs a paradigm shift in the way that it views privacy, which is precisely why we are proposing a human rights-based approach to privacy protections. A human rights-based approach, simply put, according to the United Nations, is anchoring policies, programs, and processes in a system of human rights and ensuring that institutions have the capacity to meet those obligations. Canada has a justification in order to create a human rights-based approach based on federal and international legal instruments that actually exist within Canada. And so to us, from our research and conversations, we have identified two key pillars to a human rights-based approach to privacy protections, which also form the basis of our two thematic recommendations that my colleagues will go through. The first pillar is information is inherent to personhood. All this means is that your data is you. Just because you decide to give away your data, it still means it is a part of you and should be protected as such, given that there are issues if it's misused and can lead to human rights infringements. The second pillar is inclusion and accountability foster trust. It is not enough to just say that somebody has a human right. You actually need to have someone who is responsible for safeguarding those rights and meeting those obligations. And so what we're proposing is shifting the onus away from the person and towards organizations and institutions to do their due diligence of protecting people's rights. So that looks like organizations, for example, elevating community voices and understanding how privacy infringements impact them. And it also looks like ensuring that Canada has a regulatory environment that is responsive to people's privacy concerns. With that, I will hand it off to Caroline to go through the first recommendation.
So our first recommendation is for Interact to advocate raising the level of responsibility for all private actors. So in terms of responsibility, we have bucketed into two categories. First one is safeguarding sensitive information, and the second is fill in the governance gaps. What do we mean by safeguarding sensitive information? As discussed earlier, sensitive information has not been defined in the law, defined in the new proposed bill. The idea here is that this leaves room for ambiguity for people to decide what sensitive information would constitute of. So our first recommendation is to define what it would look like. Second is to create a tiered level of penalties. So the idea is that more sensitive the information, the higher will be your penalty if there is a breach of data that happens. In terms of the second recommendation, which is filling in the governance gap, we have further divided it into two: inclusion of non-commercial actors and governance around processing and privacy-enhancing technology. Let me first talk about inclusion of non-commercial actors. Right now, the bill talks about any commercial actor who's involved in large amount of processing, use, and collection of data within the ambit of the bill. But what we are recommending is that as we know that there are a large amount of organizations like not-for-profits and political parties that collect, process, and use large amount of information, they should be looked in within the ambit of the law. To give you an example, January this year, the Canadian Green Party was found to have a huge data breach that they were faced with. If you look at it, they had a large amount of data breach in terms of voters' ID, names, addresses, and telephone numbers that was left on the public website for a very long time. The only law that covers privacy and political parties together is the Canada Elections Act. However, within this act, the political parties can decide how their privacy guidelines would look like. There is no oversight mechanism to ensure that they actually adhere to the privacy laws that they have. Second, if there is a violation of the law, there is no consequence that they face. So our recommendation is to include political parties registered at the federal level to be included within the new bill. The second is governance around processing and privacy-enhancing technology. To break it down, let me first talk about processing. Processing, simply put, is the process of converting raw data into usable, readable information. Why do we talk about processing? In today's digital world, most complex decision-making is done by AI or new technologies similar to AI, which is why processing becomes one of the crucial factors that need to be discussed and seems to be missing in the bill. Currently, the bill only talks about use, collection, and disclosure. What we are talking is create a definition for what processing would look like. What are the activities that would comprise of processing? Our counterparts in the GDPR talks about processing and covers a large number of activities like retention, modification, alteration, etc. We recommend Canada also follows a similar approach. The second is privacy-enhancing technologies. For the first time, Canada talks about data-enhancing technologies, mainly de-identification and anonymization of data. Now, what do we mean by de-identification? simply the process of removing direct identifiers from a given personal information. So it's no longer personal information. Second is anonymization of data. Anonymization of data is also similar, but you permanently remove the identifiers. Why are we talking about it right now? Most organizations that collect large amount of information will use data enhancing technologies because that is a way by which they can collect and process more data, but at the same time reduce the risks associated with data collection. Currently, we have new technologies where de-identified data can be re-identified. So you can create different data sets based on de-identified data and actually take the original data that was in place. And that is a loophole because that means that if this data gets breached, your personal information is out again. So we recommend that the de-identified data still gets under the ambit of the particular law that we're talking about. And with that, we move on to the next slide.
So now I'm going to take us through our second recommendation, which is focused on engineering an environment of trust. And it specifically focuses on the second pillar of a human rights-based approach to digital privacy protections, accountability and inclusion, foster trust. And trust is essential to economic growth, and privacy is a major component of trust. So as you can see on the slide, we have what we like to call a compliance gauge. And you'll see it goes from promotion to appeal, and that is part of the inclusion and accountability pillar that we've mentioned. And you'll see in the center, we have stakeholder and community perspectives. And as we go from promotion to appeal through our recommendation, stakeholder and community perspectives will lie at the center throughout because it's essential that digital privacy protections, economic growth, trust are considered in the context of engaging with everyday Canadians across the country. So the first component of our second recommendation focuses on stakeholder and community perspectives, so that compliance promotion in terms of inclusion. And we are recommending that businesses like Interac, as part of a human rights-based approach to digital privacy, adopt a corporate social responsibility strategy to engage with stakeholders, communities, and everyday Canadians in a conversation around digital privacy to ensure that their concerns and what they're hoping to see is reflected in this changing paradigm. And a human rights-based approach specifically will include the stakeholder and community perspective throughout to ensure that their human rights are being taken into account. And a model that we looked at was done by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. They convened conversations around AI as they are a nonprofit focused on AI research, and they brought together policy experts from around the country to convene on that subject. And a pitfall that was identified was that they did not engage with community and stakeholder perspectives. So this is also why we are recommending that be included. Our second aspect of our second recommendation is also focused on compliance promotion, specifically in providing guidance to businesses as this privacy regime changes and as they need to adapt, not just to Canadian changes, but to changes that are happening around the world. And we're specifically recommending that the OPC establish a dedicated advisory support directorate for small and medium-sized enterprises and nonprofit organizations. This is because both are essential to Canada's economy. Canadians, small and medium-sized enterprises make up about 98% of businesses in Canada, and Canadians are very reliant on services provided by nonprofits daily. And they are also more likely to have less resources, finances, expertise, and knowledge when it comes to digital privacy protections. Our research has shown that in some cases, small and medium-sized enterprises were working with sensitive information but didn't know it was sensitive information. And as a result, it was left vulnerable to potential digital privacy infringements. So in having this advisory directorate, they can have this specialized support for their unique challenges and ensure that they are following the law as they adapt. And what this advisory directorate would look like is it would be made up of what we would call data protection aides who would receive submissions for advice from SMEs and nonprofit organizations and can respond over email, by letter, in person on an ongoing basis, depending on the complexity and nature of the question at hand. And they will also develop a guidance toolkit for businesses and nonprofits to access at any time. And lastly, they will also post all of this information to their website to raise awareness in adding capacity to the advisory supports they provide to businesses and specifically SMEs and also nonprofit organizations. And now we will look at our third component of our second recommendation, which is focused on the compliance enforcement aspect of our gauge. And this is to give the OPC the ability to issue fines in addition to the order-making powers that it would currently be provided with under the proposed Bill C-27. Currently, while they have order-making powers under this proposed legislation, they would not be able to issue fines and would have to request for those fines to be issued from another body, which thereby would delay the process by which businesses and Canadians alike are not getting the results and justice that they need with regards to digital privacy concerns as in a timely manner, and that's especially concerning in this changing and fast-paced data environment. So in incorporating being able to issue fines in addition to order-making powers within the OPC, this will ensure that this process is faster so that Canadians and businesses can get the results that they need in a timely manner. And with that, I'll hand it over to Imani to take us through our implementation plan.
Thanks, Lisa. So to wrap it all up, this is our plan for seeing these different recommendations come into place. We'll start on the top line with legislative changes. As we mentioned, Bill C-27 is currently making its way through the House. It's at committee stage. We expect that this may pass in 2024 with an adoption period at some point in 2025. Keeping that in mind, organizations such as the Office of the Privacy Commissioner should be in the process of planning for implementation in 2024 throughout to 2025 and even towards 2026 for the different rollout of the different programs and policy changes that we've mentioned here. We've also laid out a timeline for the Corporate Social Responsibility Initiative. We have it overlapping with the legislative changes because we believe that it's important that businesses take the chance to understand what's important to Canadians as these new laws start to come into place. We've estimated that costs for these CSR initiatives for large organizations can probably range between $50,000 to $200,000. This is based on estimates and previous costs from other consultations that businesses and not-for-profit organizations have done on initiatives such as smart city consultations. And finally, we have the deployment of the supports that we mentioned in the last bit of the recommendations, which is the administration of penalties and also the establishment of a new advisory directorate for SMEs and not-for-profit organizations. Now, ultimately, we're looking at taking a human rights-based approach because taking a human rights-based approach gets you to implement Canadians' values into privacy law. Recapping some of the key recommendations that we put forward today, there was 1, raising the level of responsibility for private actors, and 2, engineering an environment of trust. We've brought back our visual from beforehand of the different robustness levels, and we would be happy to explain to you how we actually change these levels based on the recommendations that we put forward. So if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to double click on, please feel free. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Ian Scott, first juror.
I am first. Thank you. That was very, very interesting, and you covered again a broad range of issues. I had maybe go at this at the sort of very highest level in terms of challenge for businesses in particular to deal with institutional change in different countries simultaneously. So, in Canada, we've been, and I guess in the U.S. too, in North America, we've been making adjustments responding to Europe for several years now. Europe may further stiffen their privacy legislation. And when I have been in the United States, I find a much greater reluctance, particularly in the corporate communities than is the case in Canada, to move. And then Canada is somewhere in between. How do you see that evolving? I mean, that if Canada's moving gingerly, let's say, towards more of a European model, but are not moving all the way there, so there'll remain inconsistencies. And the U.S., unless it acts quickly, will be further, more different. So what does that mean for Canadian business, and what do you think, we should do about it? Should it be more aggressive, or I'll leave it to you to fill in the blanks. Thank you.
And sorry, just to clarify, when you're asking this at the sort of higher level, do you mean things around cost of compliance? Like, is there a specific angle with which you wanted us to answer this question?
I'll leave it to you to choose. I meant
Sure.
it represents a challenge for companies and countries. Let me rephrase it or simplify it. What are the implications of these continuing significant differences between Europe, Canada, United States? The fact that we do not have sort of a similar model. What are the implications for that?
Definitely, there are implications in terms of interoperability, which I'll first start off with maybe comparing Canada and Europe. We have a trade imperative to actually change our regime right now. The GDPR, what Europe does, just for context for everyone, is they have something called an adequacy requirement for countries. So if you are doing business with European customers, you actually need to be able to have a data protection regime that is as stringent or comparably stringent to that of Europe. And right now, Canada and Canadian businesses enjoys a limited adequacy status, but that is providing impetus for Canada to actually update its laws, because we might not meet that, and that's a very real concern. So in terms of us not moving forward at all, that's a huge trade risk. In terms of our comparability with the United States, we definitely have leeway. If you start thinking about trade agreements and CUSMA, we have leeway to be able to update our privacy protections as seen fit, so as long as it doesn't impede on trade. So that's definitely a consideration to think about moving forward. In terms of how it is businesses have to think about navigating changes, Canada is behind. So a lot of big companies and a lot of companies have actually started to move towards updating their laws. And if we're starting to move in a similar direction, and if you see globally, really the direction we're moving towards is better consumer protections and more privacy protections. So that is a broad strokes directions and a signal for businesses to start preparing. Okay, these are what laws I have to start being compliant with. These are considerations I need to have as I start creating my services and my businesses. And they can start, I think, because other jurisdictions have already updated. Canada's actually at an advantage in the fact that we're learning. We can start learning about best practices from other regimes and what it is we should maybe avoid doing, so as to not put additional compliance burden on the businesses that exist here. Yeah.
I'm going to quickly add to that, just in terms of, businesses adapting, given what Harshini mentioned about the GDPR, and also that Quebec's Law 25 also has a requirement that any business that is providing services to residents of Quebec also have to be in line with Quebec's law. Businesses are having to adapt regardless of whether the U.S. changes its privacy regime or how Canada ends up changing it. And this is why we are also recommending not just recommendations that are similar to what we're already seeing that like-minded jurisdictions have adopted, so that there's a better match there, but also that businesses are getting that expansion of advisory services that they're going to need to be able to adapt effectively and be in compliance with the many laws they're dealing with as they are working with information. So that will help them with that.
Kind of a similar question. You call for Bill C-27 to be extended to other non-commercial actors, political parties, SMEs. So I'm just curious, like from the work you've done, how do you see that balance between the need to protect privacy, but ensuring companies don't have like excessive regulatory burdens to comply with, especially SMEs, right? If there's going to be fines and compliance costs, like how do you ensure they're not overburdened with that, and it's just bad for business? So your take on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that was one of the biggest concerns that we heard from stakeholders, the regulatory compliance burden on SMEs in particular. And that's why we came up with the recommendation 2.2 to actually establish a dedicated advisory body for SMEs and not-for-profit organizations that maybe haven't had that much experience in actually adhering to privacy law because it wasn't taken very seriously before. Now, in addition to having that support for SMEs to try and reduce that burden or at least give them some support, we also recommend that the OPC take greater measures to provide resources, like on-demand resources for these organizations, similar to what's done in other countries, and particularly countries that fall under the rule of the GDPR. There are some examples of the CINAHL, which is the OPC equivalent in France, and also the Spanish Data Protection Authority, that actually provide automated data tools for these organizations to be able to know, okay, what do I need in my privacy policy? What is it exactly that I should be looking for when I'm doing a risk-based assessment, so that they have the tools that they need to be able to comply with the law. And that's something that the OPC should definitely look to implementing in their regime as well. Thank you.
Just to add to that, we also recommended this because this is the foundation is trust. When you have political parties who can actually come within the ambit of this particular bill that we're proposing, you're establishing trust with the Canadians and the voters in general. So I think just to cover the part that you talked about non-political actors also being covered within the bill. I think that was one of the bases by which we were like, trust will be the foundation for non-commercial actors, but for commercial actors, it could be the basis by which a longevity of businesses are ensured, because you're keeping trust as the foundation. And at the same time, the consumers are freely giving data now. They know where the data is going. So yeah, just to add to that.
I was really interested in one of your slides around protection of sensitive data. And it was quite a relief to see the human rights-based approach, where it doesn't matter that in a weak moment, and I wanted tickets to this concert, I signed off my life to Ticketmaster so I could see the Bee Gees or something. And wish I hadn't, but it's gone. And the responsibility then, as I understand it in the other model, is that information is actually part of me, and sensitive information would be defined in ways where it's actually needed. So that would be fantastic, but it sounds much harder to do than it actually, sounds very difficult to do. And you mentioned that the definitions are not yet there, so we don't actually know what it means. But could you talk about what are the thorniest issues in actually coming to agreement on what constitutes private information, even once I have given my permission?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. In terms of gaining consensus on how to define sensitive information, we have seen and did look at other jurisdictions that have actually defined sensitive information, and it was very helpful to see that they form their definitions in a manner that was context dependent within their own environments. And on top of that, we do see in PIPEDA, Bill C-27, there is language around what general personal information is. And as was mentioned, it does make reference to sensitive information. Like, for example, in Bill C-27, it says that children's information should be treated as sensitive. But again, it doesn't really say what that actually means in practice. And on top of that, it also references in terms of, evaluating the sensitivity levels of information that's being worked with, and other measures like that. And in terms of landing on, what that definition would look like in a Canadian context, we have included in our recommendation that it's important that engagement and extensive research and consultation is done to ensure that the definition that would be added to the legislation is very helpful and representative of what Canadians are asking for, what their values are, but also making sure it's context appropriate for Canada. And, Quebec does have a good example of how it defines sensitive information that's relevant to a Quebec and broader Canadian context as well. And then lastly, the OPC actually has already provided an interpretation of sensitive information, which is very helpful and, of course, very relevant to a Canadian context. That being said, because of the ombuds model, it is not binding. So right now, while there is that interpretation, businesses can decide for themselves what they're going to consider sensitive or not. And the OPC has actually also advocated for a definition of sensitive information to be added to the proposed Bill C-27 in order to establish this general principle and clarity around what sensitive information is. So there is definitely a lot of precedent in addition to more research that would be needed to ensure that everyone can align on a definition that would be appropriate for Canada and the broader regions that are working with Canada. Thank you.
Okay, the next 10 minutes are for sponsors and coaches. So the sponsor, coming from the sponsor table.
Hi everyone, Phil Pellegrini from Interact. Excellent presentation. Quick question for you. You talked a little bit about the adequacy decisions with GDPR and the rest of the world. Right now in Canada, we have Law 25 in Quebec that's coming in force in less than 8 weeks or so. C-27 is still a draft. How would you bridge that gap within Canada, between the provinces? I was wondering if you can give some thoughts to that.
Thank you for raising that question. I'll just inform folks who don't already know. The federal government has privacy laws, but so do the provinces. However, the federal government's privacy law, PIPEDA, applies to any province that doesn't have a substantially similar privacy law. Quebec is one of the provinces that receives an exception because it has a substantially similar privacy law. So having these different laws at the federal level and provincial level has caused some confusions for businesses in the past. Now, what we're hoping to do to bridge the gap here between laws like Law 25 and the upcoming Bill C-27 is harmonize things. The recommendations that we put forward for what Bill C-27 ought to look like looks a lot more similar to Law 25 as it does to PIPEDA, the past legislation that we had before. I would also point out that Bill C-27 will never be able to completely replicate Law 25 because there are certain divisions of powers between the federal government and the provincial government. So the federal government is responsible and has jurisdiction over issues of trade and commerce. However, the provinces do have jurisdiction over property and civil rights. So I can't show you the slide that we had up beforehand, but you may have noticed that some of the robustness levels that we had on our human rights-based approach could only go so far, and that's because the federal government can only go so far in protecting privacy rights because it's limited in what it can do under the Constitution. So what this approach does is it does the best that it possibly can in order to match one of the more stringent laws that are within the country already so that we can start to have a bit more of a harmonized privacy law across the country. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
So first of all, guys, great presentation, really thorough work, very thoughtful. Can tell that you guys did a really effective and efficient environmental scan. And I think that's the most important thing from a Canadian public policy making perspective. We often get trickle down policies from the EU in Canada, and having a great understanding or a comprehensive understanding of what the landscape is always the most important first step for making policy recommendations. Looks like you guys did an incredibly thorough job at that, so great work. My question has to do with unintended policy consequences. So, you can have incredibly well-baked policy framework, but real-world contingencies always impact how policy is implemented. So what kind of real world contingencies would impact contextually the implementation of a policy framework like this? And what do you think some of those mitigating factors would be?
So yeah, playing a little dance there. One factor that we considered extensively is the possibility of an election being called. Right now, the proposed Bill C-27 has gone through first and second reading in the House of Commons and is currently at committee. And, we know that will likely take a few months, and then it will come back to the House, and then it still needs to go through Senate as well before it can receive royal assent and then come into force. So, that could take some time. And so we've kind of factored in a couple possibilities. Firstly, as the government has done with other issues as well, given that digital privacy protections is a very pertinent issue for many Canadians, it is a priority. And if the government deems that it's a necessary priority to push through before an election, and maybe that will get them some brownie points as well. We can see that they may accelerate the bill and have it implemented before an election. And if an election is called and Parliament is dissolved and Bill C-27 does end up dying on the order paper, digital privacy issues are not going anywhere. It's still going to remain a priority. People are still concerned and want change. And therefore, when a new government comes in, it will likely remain a priority for them as well. And that poses an opportunity for all of us, including businesses like Interact, to engage on what Canadians would like to see in the potential new legislation that would be developed and implemented.
Okay, over to our coach, Neil Bauer.
Yeah, great presentation, informative, and great analysis. None of you were privacy experts when you started on this journey, so I'm interested to know collectively what the biggest shift in thinking that you undertook as part of the project.
We can come back. We're just so excited to talk to you today. I think for us, probably one of the biggest shifts is like cutting through the rhetoric, as we like to call it. I'll give you maybe a very, very prominent example. One of the biggest things we heard from stakeholders and saw in our research when we first started was, oh my God, the consent-based model is failing. And let me explain. It's the same as like if you folks open up a browser and then they say, do you want to access this article? Accept all cookies. And you're like, oh, I don't care. Just accept my cookies and do whatever it is you want. Track me however it is you want. And that was kind of something that, we came across as like, okay, this is failing. Maybe you need to move beyond a post-consent world and try to create something that doesn't really need, people to be accepting cookies in this regard. As we did more research, as we understood the law, what we realized was, first of all, consent is very, very important. It empowers a person to be able to make a choice. The problem isn't the fact that a person is making a choice. The problem is the environment in which a person is making this choice. And this is something that I brought up with the human rights-based approach. Essentially, what we've done with our recommendations is thought about, okay, we want people to be able to have a choice because that's very important. But how do we raise the floor so that they can make one that is safe for themselves? And how do we ensure that the onus isn't on the person to be able to read all these legal documents that are 5,000 pages long, but rather that they are able to trust that whatever is in that 5,000 documents has been done their due diligence, because businesses are following a law that is strict. And if they don't follow a law that is strict, there's a regulatory environment that responds to the fact that they are not doing so. So I think that would be perhaps a pivotal shift for us is actually cutting through the rhetoric of what people are saying are failing and more so considering, all right, what is the law says and what do we actually need to think about in terms of changing? I don't know if anyone has anything to add.
Just add to that. Another thing that we discussed was, at the end of the day, these technologies are created by human beings. What we're talking about is a paradigm shift And for that, we require individuals at the end of the innovation and technology that is happening to think about it, think about privacy as a human right issue. So you're creating algorithms, you're the one creating all the automated decision making that is taking place. At the end of the day, it is being created by humans. So we want that shift to take place. And I think that was something that the process was evolutionary, because we started off with a very completely different perspective onto things to come to this and actually think that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that there is scope for a human rights based approach. So yeah, I think that was something that we came up with.
Great job. Great job, me again. I know I'm the annoying one. I was just wondering, throughout the semester, right, the speed of innovation is so much faster than the speed of regulation. Yeah. And the last few weeks, months, even like, not year, but like just the last few months, AI is on everyone's lips, right? What are your thoughts about the intersection between artificial intelligence and privacy as a human right?
Great question. Thank you. I've already said this, because we firmly believe that artificial intelligence is right now what is the decision making is, or complex decision making is done by artificial intelligence. It is the future. And I think what we are trying to create is, because we're trying to create a paradigm shift, it is essential that the foundations are laid straight. We know that IDA is still in the making, which is the artificial intelligence bill that is in place. We recognize it, but what we're creating is, the first step towards that is defining what processing would look like. Right now, we don't have a clear definition what processing looks like in Canada, and that is a range of activities. And if you have to compare the decision making that is done with collection and usage as compared to decisions that are done on artificial intelligence, it's based on processing. So that is something that we are going to keep calling for, like defined processing. That's, to answer your question.
Okay, folks, we are down to the last 7 minutes. Questions open to anybody. I'm just going to suggest again, but you've been ignoring me most of the day, so don't worry about it. That questions be short and answers are short, so we can get lots of them in. My first question is to Dan Weinstock. Why don't you have a question?
I do have a question.
Okay, hold on.
Oh, the jury has a question.
First?
Embarrassed. But you did kind of start answering it a moment ago. I can't remember who was talking. I think it was Harshini. A lot of privacy scholars are saying now that the consent model is we can't possibly consent. There's somebody who calculated how long it would take to read all of the, and it's like 44 days full time to read all of the things that you putatively accept whenever you buy a concert ticket or whatever, so that it's not possible to consent anymore. So did you consider at any point, even to reject it as unfeasible, radically different ways of addressing this? Like my colleague Ignacio Cofone at the Faculty of Law at McGill proposes that it be dealt with sort of like that the harms that befall us because of the way in which our data is collected and compounded in ways that is beyond the control of pretty much anybody. That the harms that befall us be treated like environmental damage and therefore subject not so much to human rights remedies, but like tort-like remedies, like civil liability sort of thing. Did you sort of consider that sort of radically different model, even if only to reject it afterwards is perhaps not feasible?
Sure. Okay. Thanks so much for that question, Professor Weinstock. Sorry for touching the mic, Weston. But I will start out by saying that one good thing about Bill C-27 is it does clearly articulate individuals' private right to action as it concerns privacy. So there is that ability to seek recourse for violations of your privacy rights or where you've experienced harm as it concerns a violation of your privacy rights. In terms of other things that we, sort of dipped our toes into and then backed away from, some of those included some of the privacy rights that we're seeing in other regimes. One of those was the right to be forgotten. It's in the GDPR. California has a version of it as well, and it has certain carve-outs. However, when we conducted our interviews with various stakeholders to understand what it would actually mean to implement the right to be forgotten, there are certain challenges and other rights that the right to be forgotten brushes up against. One, there's the feasibility challenge of organizations not actually being able to fully delete data. They can do their best to delete it. However, due to some legacy systems, it's almost impossible to completely get rid of it. So what we've really tried to do is create an environment where you have a robust protection of the data no matter what. The other issue with the right to be forgotten is that it can brush up against certain other rights, such as we have a freedom of the press. There are going to be news organizations that are going to publish personal information in order to report on the news. You're not going to be able to fully realize that right to be forgotten in the presence of those other rights in our system. Thanks.
Okay, I've got Ian and then Anmol.
This is, I promise, a very short one. You mentioned the possibility of an election interfering with the passage of C-27. Maybe a more short-term and pragmatic one would be prorogation of Parliament, which would also mean the legislation would die on the order paper unless there was all-party agreement. Would you anticipate that there could be all-party agreement to maintain C-27's current status if there's prorogation?
Short question, short answer, yes. If you actually look at the Hansard records for the debates around this, pretty much all parties are on board for wanting to have some kind of stronger legislation in Canada. Perhaps where they disagree is the nitty-gritty details, but that's what our democracy is for, is to be able to debate and deliberate what those details would look like. But I think there would be consensus for all parties, and I would recommend
Okay, with
reading
that quick
Hansard.
answer, we might get a second question. Anmol and then Asma if we have time.
Terrific presentation, team. Congratulations. At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about two cases, a Cambridge Analytica case and the Home Depot case. And I think oftentimes when we think about companies or corporations taking our data to target ads or products to us, it's always seen as a negative thing. But I can also imagine an argument that it's also perhaps a positive thing, that we benefit from those in our daily lives. The fact that TikTok's algorithm takes information from me and shows me more dog videos and cat videos benefits me greatly, right? So I'm curious, how did you think about perhaps those positive aspects of the current data regime that we have in place in your policy making process, and if you think that your proposal is going to actually take away some of those benefits from everyday people?
Thanks, Anmol. I will say that was something that was at the forefront of this project. I told the team repeatedly, I love my Spotify. I love the Spotify AI DJ. I love that it knows exactly who I am and gives me the music that I want to listen to. But I also want to know that Spotify protects my information in a way that is in accordance with my own values and making sure that that doesn't get leaked. So what we've tried to do here is introduce a system where you're incentivizing high protection of people's sensitive information. So going back to recommendation 1.1, we introduced the tiered system so that organizations that decide that they want to know your biometric data or they want to know your race or your political affiliation also know how to adequately protect that information, because if they don't take that seriously, they will be fined in accordance with that. So that was our sort of balance, I would say, on needing to ensure that people have their privacy rights, but also wanting to make sure that people enjoy the full fruits of innovation that global businesses and Canadian businesses have to offer. Thanks.
Okay, Asma, final question, quick like a bunny.
I don't know if it's going to be a quick one. In the answer, the question is really, really short. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was a really great one. Imani, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to expand on your last slide when you said if you had questions on this, could you please ask it? So I'm asking the question.
Okay, there were 6 different levels. Which one do you want to know about? Okay, let's talk enforcement. So this one was, for me, I think the almost easiest recommendation to make, because in our interviews with stakeholders, many agreed, and this was across the sector from private sector actors to human rights advocates to academics, that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner needs the adequate enforcement tools to do its job. As I mentioned before, they currently follow an ombuds model, and C-27 would give them order-making powers, but it still exports the issuance of fines and penalties to a different body. The problem with this is that it increases the administrative burden on the system as opposed to just housing those enforcement powers in one organization, and it can have different firewalls between them so that you can still guarantee a respect for the law and removing bias while still making sure that decisions are made quickly. The reason that the decisions need to be made quickly is because the digital landscape is changing so rapidly. We don't have time to wait 5 years for a decision to be made on whether a company has contravened the privacy law or not. Bringing those enforcement powers into the privacy regulatory body just makes sense. It's what Quebec does. It is what BC does. It is what the European Union does. It is now what California does as of 10 days ago. So Canada is quite behind in this regard, and it really is just an easy opportunity for the government to ensure that it has a robust privacy supervisory authority that's taken seriously by private actors. Thanks.
Thank you, team. Great job.